Amiens Secrets. New York, 1917. Margaret Hayes expected a War Office telegram about Sergeant Henry Whitaker, but when she opened it, the message chilled her to the bone. Margaret, I'm not dead. Don't believe them. The signature at the bottom? Henry's handwriting. Chapter 1. The Telegram and the Ghost. The crisp, white envelope felt alien in Margaret Hayes's hand, stark against the worn fabric of her morning dress. It had arrived that morning, delivered by a somber-faced boy who'd thrust it at her with the practiced attachment of one too familiar with delivering sorrow. She'd been expecting a telegram, of course. Ever since the news of Sergeant Henry Whitaker's supposed death at the Somme had reached her 3 weeks prior, she'd been bracing for the official confirmation, the cold, bureaucratic seal on a grief that had already settled deep in her bones. But this was different. The paper felt thicker, the ink bleaker, and the weight of it in her palm suggested something more than just formal condolences. It was addressed to her, Miss Margaret Hayes, in a familiar, looping script she knew intimately, even before reading the message. Her address at the boarding house was correct, written in that same hand. A chill snaked its way down her spine, settling like ice in the pit of her stomach. She'd retreated to the small, cluttered parlor of the New York boarding house, a room that smelled perpetually of dust and boiled cabbage. Sunlight, weak and watery, filtered through the lace-curtained windows, illuminating motes of dust dancing in the air. The room was silent save for the rhythmic tick-tock of a grandfather clock in the corner, a sound that usually comforted her, but now only amplified the frantic beat of her own heart. Her fingers, trembling slightly, tore open the envelope. Inside, a single sheet of paper, folded neatly in thirds. The message was short, stark, and utterly impossible. Margaret, I'm not dead. Don't believe them. The words swam before her eyes, blurring into an incomprehensible mess. She blinked, rereading them, tracing each letter with a fingertip as if to confirm their reality. The signature at the bottom was unmistakable, a flourish she'd seen countless times on letters filled with poetry, promises, and declarations of a love she'd believed eternal. Henry. Dead Henry. Sergeant Henry Whitaker, killed in action, July 1916. She'd seen the casualty lists, his name stark and unyielding among the hundreds of others. She'd attended the memorial service, a somber affair filled with weeping women and stoic men, all grappling with the gaping hole the war had ripped in their lives. She'd worn black, the heavy fabric a physical manifestation of the emptiness that had consumed her. But this telegram, this ghost of a message, whispered a different story. A story she desperately wanted to believe, yet knew was impossible. She sank onto the worn velvet settee, the telegram clutched in her hand. The room seemed to tilt around her, the familiar objects, the faded floral wallpaper, the chipped porcelain figurines on the mantelpiece, the framed photograph of her parents all blurring into an indistinct watercolor of grief and confusion. Was it a cruel joke? A prank played by some heartless individual who knew of her loss? Or something more? Her mind raced, conjuring images of Henry. His laughing eyes, the way his dark hair curled at the nape of his neck, the warmth of his hand in hers as they strolled through Central Park on crisp autumn afternoons. He'd been so full of life, so vibrant, so real. Could he truly be gone? She remembered the last time she'd seen him, standing on the platform at Grand Central Terminal, his uniform crisp and new, a nervous smile playing on his lips. He'd held her close, whispering promises of his return, of a future they would build together, a future filled with love and laughter and the quiet joy of ordinary days. I'll write every week, Margaret, he'd vowed, his voice thick with emotion. And I'll come back to you. I promise. And he had written. Every week, a letter arrived, filled with his familiar scrawl, his words painting vivid pictures of the horrors he witnessed, the camaraderie he found in the trenches, and the unwavering love he held for her. His letters were her lifeline, a tangible connection to the man she loved, a beacon of hope in the gathering darkness. Then the letters had stopped. Abruptly. Without warning. The silence had been deafening, a void that had swallowed her whole. She clung to hope, telling herself that he was simply too busy, too caught up in the chaos of war to write. But deep down, a cold dread had begun to creep in, a premonition of the tragedy that was to come. Now this telegram, a lifeline thrown from beyond the grave? Or a cruel twist of fate, designed to shatter the fragile peace she'd begun to build around her grief? She closed her eyes, clutching the telegram to her chest. The scent of him, faint but unmistakable pipe tobacco and a hint of sandalwood clung to the paper, a phantom touch that sent a fresh wave of grief crashing over her. "Henry," she whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. "Oh." Henry, a sudden noise, the creak of a floorboard, the rustle of fabric startled her. She opened her eyes, her heart pounding. Standing in the doorway was Mrs. O'Malley, the boarding house landlady, a stout woman with a perpetually worried expression and a heart as big as her ample bosom. She was holding a tray laden with a steaming cup of tea and a plate of biscuits, her eyes filled with a mixture of concern and pity. "Margaret, dear," she said softly, her voice thick with a brogue that had softened only slightly after 20 years in America. "I saw the boy deliver the telegram. Is it bad news?" Margaret hesitated, unsure how to explain the impossible message she held in her hand. How could she tell Mrs. O'Malley that the man she'd mourned was, perhaps, not dead after all? That a ghost had reached out from beyond the grave, shattering the fragile illusion of closure she'd so desperately clung to? She looked down at the telegram, the words stark and undeniable. "I'm not dead. Don't believe them." A flicker of defiance, of something akin to hope, ignited within her. She couldn't dismiss it. Not yet. Not without knowing more. The Henrys she knew wouldn't lie. "Not about this. It's complicated," she finally said, her voice trembling slightly. "It's from Henry." Mrs. O'Malley's eyes widened, her hand flying to her mouth. "From Henry? But he's dead?" Margaret finished, a bitter smile twisting her lips. "That's what I thought, too." She held out the telegram, offering it to Mrs. O'Malley. The older woman took it gingerly, her eyes scanning the message with a mixture of disbelief and dawning horror. "Dear Lord," she whispered, crossing herself. "What does it mean?" Margaret shook her head, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. "I don't know." The words held their weight, the truth, heavy and pressing. "I don't know." But one thing she did know. She had to find out. She had to know if this was a cruel hoax, a figment of her grief-stricken imagination, or the truth. She owed it to Henry. She owed it to herself. She had to discover if the man she loved was truly gone, or if a spark of him, against all odds, still remained, somewhere in the war-torn world. She needed to know if somehow he was still alive. The telegram had lit a fire, one of desperate hope, and Margaret knew she would follow that flicker, wherever it led. Chapter 2. Whispers of a Lie. The tea grew cold, untouched. The biscuits remained on the plate, their buttery scent a stark contrast to the turmoil churning within Margaret. Mrs. O'Malley, bless her soul, had tried to offer comfort, her words a soothing balm on a wound that refused to heal. But Margaret's mind was elsewhere, lost in a labyrinth of possibilities, each more improbable than the last. After Mrs. O'Malley had reluctantly retreated, promising to keep the telegram a secret, Margaret paced the small parlor, the floorboards creaking beneath her restless steps. She reread the message a dozen times, each time searching for a clue, a hint, a sign that would reveal its true meaning. Don't believe them. Who were they? The War Office? The government? His fellow soldiers? The very fabric of reality that insisted Henry was gone? She considered the possibilities, each one more unsettling than the last. Could Henry have been captured? Was he a prisoner of war, sending a coded message through some clandestine channel? Or had he deserted, abandoning his duty and his country for reasons she couldn't comprehend? The thought sent a shiver of unease through her. Desertion was a stain on a man's honor, a betrayal of everything Henry had stood for. She couldn't reconcile that image with the man she loved. Another, even more terrifying possibility loomed, that he was suffering from shell shock, his mind fractured by the horrors he'd witnessed, his memories twisted and distorted. She'd read accounts of soldiers returning from the front lines, their minds shattered, their personalities irrevocably altered. Could Henry be one of them, lost in a fog of confusion, believing himself to be alive when he was, in fact, dead? The thought was unbearable. She pushed it away, clinging to the fragile hope that the telegram offered. She decided she needed to talk to someone who knew Henry, someone who might shed light on this impossible situation. She thought of Samuel, Henry's closest friend, a fellow soldier who had been wounded at the Somme and sent back to New York to recover. Samuel had been a frequent visitor to the boarding house in the weeks following Henry's supposed death, his presence a small comfort in her overwhelming grief. He had carried Henry's last letter to her, a letter filled with longing and the shadow of premonition. She found Samuel's address in a small, leather-bound book where she kept the addresses of Henry's family and friends. He lived in a modest apartment building in Brooklyn, not far from the Navy Yard. She grabbed her coat and hat, a sense of urgency propelling her forward. The journey to Brooklyn was a blur of crowded streets, clanging trolley cars, and the ever-present hum of a city trying to maintain a semblance of normalcy in the face of war. The faces she saw were etched with worry, the newspapers filled with headlines of battles and casualties, the air thick with a mixture of patriotism and fear. She found Samuel's apartment building, a red brick structure with a faded awning and a chipped stoop. She climbed the stairs, her heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and dread. She knocked on the door, her knuckles rapping against the worn wood. After a moment, the door creaked open, revealing Samuel standing in the dimly lit hallway. He looked thinner than she remembered, his face pale and drawn, his left arm still in a sling. His eyes, usually bright and full of life, were shadowed with a weariness that spoke of the horrors he'd endured. "Margaret?" he said, his voice a raspy whisper. What brings you here?" She held out the telegram, her hand trembling slightly. "I received this today," she said, her voice catching in her throat. "It's from Henry." Samuel's eyes widened, his expression shifting from surprise to disbelief to something akin to pity. He took the telegram gingerly, his fingers tracing the familiar handwriting. "Margaret," he said softly, his voice laced with a sadness that mirrored her own. This is impossible. Henry's gone. I saw him fall." His words were a blow, a confirmation of the reality she'd been trying to deny. But she refused to give up. "But the telegram," she insisted, her voice rising slightly. "His handwriting the message, don't believe them. What does it mean, Samuel?" Samuel sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. He led her into the small apartment, a sparsely furnished room that smelled of antiseptic and stale cigarette smoke. He gestured for her to sit on a worn armchair, while he perched on the edge of the bed, his injured arm resting awkwardly in his lap. "Margaret," he began, his voice heavy with regret. "I know this is hard. But sometimes things happen in war that defy explanation. Men see things, experience things, that change them. They come back different. Or they don't come back at all." He paused, his gaze fixed on the telegram in his hand. "I saw Henry fall, Margaret. I saw the explosion. There was nothing left. He was gone. Instantly." His words painted a vivid, brutal picture, a scene she'd tried to avoid imagining. She closed her eyes, the image of Henry, his body torn apart by the force of the explosion, flashing behind her eyelids. "But this," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "How can you explain this?" Samuel shook his head, his expression a mixture of confusion and despair. "I don't know," he admitted. Maybe it's a cruel joke. Someone who knew about Henry, who knew about you, or maybe it's a message from beyond." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a strange mixture of fear and wonder. "I've heard stories, Margaret," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Stories of soldiers who refuse to die, who come back in some form or another, to finish unfinished business, to say goodbye." Margaret shivered, the implications of his words sending a chill down her spine. Was Henry a ghost, a restless spirit seeking to communicate with her? Was this telegram a message from the other side, a desperate attempt to reach out from beyond the veil of death? Or was it something else entirely? Something more sinister? A new thought, a seed of doubt, began to take root in her mind. What if Samuel wasn't telling her the whole truth? What if he knew more than he was letting on? He'd been there at the Somme. He'd seen Henry fall. But what if he'd also seen something else? She looked at him, her gaze searching, probing. "Samuel," she said, her voice low and steady. "Tell me everything. Everything you saw. Everything you know." He hesitated, his eyes avoiding hers. He shifted uncomfortably on the bed, his injured arm twitching slightly. I told you, Margaret," he stammered. "I saw him fall. There was nothing I could do." But Margaret wasn't convinced. There was something in his eyes, a flicker of uncertainty, a hint of something hidden, that told her he wasn't being entirely truthful. There was something else, some unsaid truth between them. It was the beginning of a wedge, the first crack in a truth she had blindly accepted. She stood looking down. "Thank you, Samuel," she spoke quietly, "for your time." As she walked towards the door, she stopped. One last question lingered, one that would confirm her suspicions, or put them to rest. "Samuel," she turned, her gaze locking with his, the question hanging heavy in the air, "did Henry ever mention anything unusual? Before it happened?" His eyes flickered, betraying the lie he was about to tell. The silence, stretching, gave him away, even before his words did. Chapter 3. The Sergeant's Scars. Samuel's hesitation was a chasm, a gaping void where truth should have resided. He stammered, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape route from her piercing gaze. "Unusual?"
No.
"Nothing. Just the usual war talk."
Fear.
"Longing for home." "You, Margaret."
He always talked about you.
But Margaret saw the lie shimmering beneath the surface, the carefully constructed facade of grief and camaraderie crumbling under the weight of her scrutiny. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that Samuel was hiding something. Something significant. Something about Henry. She left his apartment, the unanswered question hanging heavy in the air between them. The streets of Brooklyn seemed darker now, the shadows longer, the city's hum a discordant symphony of secrets and lies. Back in her small room at the boarding house, Margaret spread out the telegram on the worn table, the stark message staring up at her like an accusation. "I'm not dead. Don't believe them." She traced the letters of Henry's signature, her fingers lingering on the familiar loops and swirls. It was his handwriting, undeniably. But the message was a riddle wrapped in a mystery, shrouded in the fog of war. She needed to find someone who could decipher it, someone who understood the language of war, the hidden codes and clandestine communications that might be lurking beneath the surface of those simple words. She needed someone who knew Henry, not just as a friend, but as a soldier. She remembered Sergeant Major Elias Thorne, Henry's commanding officer, a man who had written her a brief, formal letter of condolence after Henry's supposed death. The letter had been stiff and impersonal, offering little comfort, but it had included a return address, a military post office box in New York City. She decided to take a chance. She penned a carefully worded letter to Sergeant Major Thorne, explaining the situation, the telegram, the unsettling feeling that something wasn't right. She emphasized her desperate need for answers, her unwavering belief that Henry would never have sent such a message without a reason. She pleaded with him to meet with her, to share any information he might have, no matter how small or insignificant it might seem. She mailed the letter the next morning, her heart filled with a mixture of hope and trepidation. She knew it was a long shot, that Sergeant Major Thorne was a busy man, a soldier with more important things to worry about than the ravings of a grieving woman. But she had to try. Days turned into a week, and still, there was no reply. Margaret's hope began to dwindle, replaced by a growing sense of despair. She started to believe that Samuel was right, that the telegram was nothing more than a cruel hoax, a figment of her imagination. Then, one rainy afternoon, a knock on her door shattered the silence. Standing on the doorstep, his uniform dripping wet, his face grim and unreadable, was Sergeant Major Elias Thorne. He was a tall, imposing man, his shoulders broad, his back ramrod straight. His hair was cropped close to his skull, revealing a network of fine lines etched around his eyes, the telltale signs of a life spent in the harsh realities of war. His eyes, a steely gray, held a depth of experience that made Margaret feel both intimidated and strangely comforted. He held an envelope, her own letter within it. "Miss Hayes?" he said, his voice deep and resonant, his tone formal and reserved. "Yes," she replied, her voice trembling slightly. "Sergeant Major Thorne?" He nodded curtly. "May I come in?" She stepped aside, allowing him to enter the small parlor. He stood stiffly, his gaze sweeping the room, taking in the worn furniture, the faded wallpaper, the lingering scent of grief. "You wrote to me about Sergeant Whitaker," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Yes," Margaret replied, her heart pounding in her chest. "I received a telegram. From him." She held out the telegram, her hand shaking. Sergeant Major Thorne took it, his eyes scanning the message with a practiced scrutiny. He read it once, then twice, his expression unchanging. "This is unusual," he finally said, his voice betraying a hint of surprise. Sergeant Whitaker was a good soldier.
Brave.
Loyal. Dedicated. But, Margaret prompted, her voice filled with a desperate hope. Sergeant Major Thorne hesitated, his gaze fixed on the telegram. But he was also troubled, he said, his voice dropping slightly. He saw things, experienced things that changed him. He looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pity and concern. "Miss Hayes," he said, his voice softening slightly. "I understand your grief. But Sergeant Whitaker is dead. I saw the casualty reports myself. His name was on the list." Margaret felt a wave of despair wash over her. She'd hoped, against all odds, that Sergeant Major Thorne would offer some explanation, some glimmer of hope. But his words were a confirmation of the official story, the reality she'd been trying to deny. But then, he said something that made her blood run cold. However, he continued, his voice low and conspiratorial. There were rumors. Whispers. About Sergeant Whitaker. About his assignment. He paused, his gaze locking with hers. He was involved in something sensitive, Miss Hayes. Something that required secrecy. Something that might have put his life in danger. Even before he went to the front. Margaret felt a surge of adrenaline, a renewed sense of hope mixed with a growing unease. "What kind of assignment?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Sergeant Major Thorne leaned closer, his voice dropping to a murmur. "I can't tell you the details, Miss Hayes. It's classified. But I can tell you this. Sergeant Whitaker was working on something that could have made him a target. For both sides." He handed back her letter, folded neatly. This message could be genuine, but it also could be bait. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a warning. "Be careful, Miss Hayes. Very careful. You may be in more danger than you realize." He hesitated, a shadow falling across his features. There was one more thing he wanted to say. One more detail he had left out, a detail that changed everything. "There's something else, Miss Hayes. Something about the casualty report. Sergeant Whitaker. He wasn't identified by his face. His dog tags were found on a body that was unrecognizable." He met her gaze, the gravity of the situation weighing heavy in his next words. "There's a chance, Miss Hayes, albeit a slim one, that Henry Whitaker might still be alive." The rain had stopped, and a sliver of sunlight broke through the clouds. Chapter 4. A Dance of Doubt. The sergeant major's words hung in the air, a fragile thread of hope spun amidst a web of uncertainty and danger. A chance, albeit a slim one, that Henry Whitaker might still be alive. The phrase echoed in Margaret's mind, a lifeline in the turbulent sea of her grief. Sergeant Major Thorne departed as abruptly as he'd arrived, leaving Margaret with more questions than answers. He'd refused to elaborate on Henry's sensitive assignment, citing its classified nature. But his warning, "Be careful, Miss Hayes. You may be in more danger than you realize," resonated with a chilling clarity. She spent the rest of the day in a state of heightened anxiety, her mind racing through a maze of possibilities. If Henry was alive, why the secrecy? Why the telegram? And who were they that she shouldn't believe? The questions swirled around her, a vortex of doubt and suspicion. She examined the telegram again, turning it over and over in her hands, searching for any hidden clues, any subtle details she might have missed. The paper was ordinary, the ink standard issue. But the handwriting was undeniably Henry's. She remembered the countless letters he'd written her, the intimate details he'd shared, the secret language of love they'd created between them. He'd often used code words, playful references to shared memories and inside jokes, to disguise his true feelings from prying eyes. Could the telegram be another coded message? A cry for help disguised as a denial of death? She spent hours poring over his old letters, searching for a pattern, a recurring phrase, a hidden meaning that might unlock the secret of the telegram. She found nothing concrete, but a nagging feeling persisted, a sense that she was missing something crucial. She decided to revisit Samuel, despite her suspicions. She needed to confront him, to force him to reveal what he knew. She arrived at his apartment building late in the evening, the streets shrouded in a misty fog. The air was thick with the smell of coal smoke and damp earth, a scent that evoked memories of Henry, of his presence, of his love. She found Samuel sitting alone in his dimly lit apartment, a bottle of whiskey on the table beside him, his injured arm resting awkwardly in his lap. He looked even more haggard than before, his eyes bloodshot, his face pale and drawn. He seemed surprised to see her, a flicker of fear crossing his features. "Margaret," he said, his voice slurred with alcohol. What are you doing here?" She didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I saw Sergeant Major Thorne," she said, her voice firm and unwavering. "He told me about Henry's assignment. He said it was sensitive." Samuel's eyes widened, his expression shifting from surprise to alarm. He took a long swig of whiskey, his hand trembling slightly. "He shouldn't have told you that," he stammered. It's classified." "But he did," Margaret pressed, her gaze unwavering. "And he said there were rumors. About Henry. About what happened at the Somme." Samuel avoided her gaze, his eyes fixated on the bottle of whiskey. "Rumors are just rumors, Margaret," he muttered. "Don't listen to them." "But what if they're true?" she insisted. "What if Henry didn't die? What if he's still out there somewhere needing our help?" Samuel finally looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and despair. "Margaret," he said, his voice heavy with regret. I lied to you. There was something I didn't tell you." Margaret felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She knew it. She'd sensed it all along. "Tell me," she demanded, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and anticipation. Samuel hesitated, his gaze shifting nervously around the room. He took another long swig of whiskey, as if gathering the courage to speak. "The night before the attack," he began, his voice barely a whisper. "Henry, he told me something. Something he swore me to secrecy." He paused, his eyes welling up with tears. He said he was working undercover. For British intelligence. He was posing as a regular soldier, but his real mission was to gather information. About a German spy ring. Operating within our own ranks. Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. A spy ring? Within their own ranks? It was a revelation that turned her world upside down. He said he was close to exposing them, Samuel continued, his voice choked with emotion. But he was afraid. He knew they were watching him. He knew his life was in danger. He looked at Margaret, his eyes filled with a profound sadness. He said if anything happened to him, I should tell you. I should tell you the truth. But I was afraid. I didn't want to believe it.
I didn't want to get involved.
He buried his face in his hands, his body shaking with sobs. "I'm sorry, Margaret," he whispered.
"I'm so sorry."
Margaret felt a wave of conflicting emotions wash over her. Anger at Samuel's betrayal, grief for Henry's presumed death, and a flicker of renewed hope, fueled by the possibility that he might still be alive. But now, a new fear gnawed at her. If Henry was working undercover, if he was close to exposing a German spy ring, then his death might have been staged. A cover-up, to protect him, or to silence him. And if he was still alive, he was in grave danger. The spies he was hunting would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. And now, Margaret was caught in the crossfire. She stood, her head spinning, her mind reeling from the implications of Samuel's confession. She looked, a newfound resolution hardening her gaze. Samuel, she spoke. Who was he working with? Samuel looked up, surprised. I don't know a name.
Just a code name.
Nightingale. He paused. Henry said if anything went wrong, I was to find Nightingale. They were the only one who could help. Margaret felt a sudden surge of determination. She had to find Nightingale. She had to find the truth. And she had to find Henry, if he was still out there, before it was too late. She would not rest, she would not yield, until she did. The dance of doubt had begun, but Margaret was ready to lead. Chapter 5. The Price of a Promise. Nightingale. The codename echoed in Margaret's mind, a mysterious whisper in the gathering storm. It was her only lead, a fragile thread connecting her to Henry's hidden world, to the dangerous game of espionage he'd been playing. Finding Nightingale, however, was like searching for a ghost in a war-torn world. Samuel knew nothing more, only that it was Henry's contact within British intelligence, the one person who might hold the key to his survival or his demise. Margaret began her search in the most logical place, the military post office box Sergeant Major Thorne had provided. She wrote another letter, this time addressed simply to Nightingale, explaining her situation, the telegram, Samuel's confession, and her desperate need for answers. She poured her heart into the letter, her words a plea for help, a testament to her unwavering love for Henry. She mailed the letter with a sense of trepidation, knowing that it might fall into the wrong hands, that it might expose her to even greater danger. But she had no other choice. She had to trust that Nightingale, whoever they were, would recognize the urgency of her message, the authenticity of her love. While she waited for response, Margaret delved deeper into Henry's past, searching for any clue, any connection that might lead her to Nightingale. She revisited his old letters, scrutinizing every word, every phrase, every seemingly insignificant detail. She examined his photographs, searching for a hidden message, a secret sign, a familiar face that might reappear. She discovered a small, leather-bound journal tucked away in a box of Henry's belongings, a journal he'd kept during his training, before he'd been deployed to France. The entries were sparse, mostly mundane accounts of daily life, drills, and lessons. But one entry caught her eye. Met with N, today. Impressed. Sharp mind. Keen instincts. Trustworthy? Time will tell. The entry was dated several months before Henry's deployment, during a period when he was undergoing specialized training in New York. And could it be Nightingale? It was a long shot, but it was the only lead she had. She decided to track down the location of Henry's training facility, hoping to find someone who might remember him, who might know something about N. She discovered that it was a covert operation, housed in a nondescript warehouse near the docks, a place where soldiers were trained in intelligence gathering, code breaking, and other clandestine skills. She visited the warehouse, posing as a researcher writing a history of the war effort. The building was now deserted, the windows boarded up, the air thick with the smell of decay. But she managed to find an old caretaker, a grizzled veteran with a missing eye and a cynical demeanor, who had worked at the facility during the war. She showed him Henry's photograph, asking if he remembered him. The caretaker squinted at the picture, his one good eye narrowing in concentration. Whitaker, he muttered, his voice raspy with age. Yeah, I remember him. Quiet fella. Kept to himself. Always asking questions. Do you remember anyone he associated with? Margaret asked, her heart pounding with anticipation. Anyone with the initial N? The caretaker thought for a moment, his brow furrowed in concentration. There was a woman, he finally said. Came to see him a few times. Sharp dresser. Spoke with an accent. British, I think. A woman? Margaret hadn't expected that. Nightingale was a woman? It was another twist in the already convoluted puzzle. Do you remember her name? Margaret pressed, her voice filled with urgency. The caretaker shook his head. Never knew her name. Just saw her talking to Whitaker. Seemed important, like she was giving him orders. He paused, his gaze drifting towards the boarded-up windows. There was something else, he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. I heard rumors. About Whitaker. About his loyalty. Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. What kind of rumors? The caretaker hesitated, his one good eye darting nervously around the room. They said he was a double agent, working for both sides, playing us against the Germans. Margaret recoiled in disbelief. A double agent? Henry? It was impossible. He was the most loyal, the most patriotic man she knew. He would never betray his country. But the caretaker's words planted a seed of doubt, a nagging suspicion that refused to be ignored. Could Henry have been playing a double game? Was he truly working for British intelligence, or was he a traitor, selling secrets to the enemy? The thought was unbearable. She pushed it away, clinging to her faith in Henry, to her belief in his unwavering love. But the seed of doubt remained, a tiny fissure in the foundation of her trust. As she left the warehouse, a figure emerged from the shadows, a woman dressed in a dark coat and hat, her face obscured by the dim light. Miss Hayes? The woman said, her voice low and cultured, her accent undeniably British. Margaret turned, her heart pounding in her chest. Yes. The woman stepped closer, her eyes, sharp and intelligent, scanning Margaret's face. I believe you've been looking for me, she said, a faint smile playing on her lips.
I'm Nightingale.
Margaret stared at her, speechless. This was the woman from the caretaker's description. The woman who had met with Henry. The woman who might hold the key to his fate. And, possibly, the woman who would change Margaret's forever. The price of promises, especially those made in times of conflict, was immeasurable. And Margaret stood at the edge of paying a dear price. Chapter 6. Across the Barricaded Sea. Nightingale. The name, spoken in that crisp British accent, sent a shiver of both relief and apprehension through Margaret. The woman standing before her was an enigma, her elegant appearance and composed demeanor a stark contrast to the grimy surroundings of the abandoned warehouse. She was slender, with dark hair pulled back in a severe bun, and her eyes, a piercing blue, held a depth of intelligence that was both captivating and intimidating. You received my letter? Margaret stammered, still reeling from the sudden encounter. Nightingale nodded. Indeed. And I must say, Miss Hayes, you've been rather resourceful. Most persistent. There was a hint of admiration in her voice, but also a subtle warning. I had to find you, Margaret replied, her voice regaining its strength. I need to know about Henry.
About what happened to him.
Nightingale gestured towards a nearby cafe, a small, unassuming establishment that seemed out of place amidst the industrial decay. Let's talk somewhere more private, she said, her gaze sweeping the surroundings, as if checking for unseen observers. They settled into a quiet corner booth, the air thick with the aroma of coffee and stale cigarette smoke. Nightingale ordered tea, her movements precise and deliberate, while Margaret opted for a simple glass of water, her nerves too frayed for anything stronger. Sergeant Whitaker was a valuable asset, Nightingale began, her voice low and measured. He was working on a highly sensitive operation involving the infiltration of a German spy ring operating within Allied forces. Margaret nodded, confirming what Samuel had already told her.
I know, she said. But what happened to him?
Is he truly dead? Nightingale hesitated, her gaze fixed on the swirling steam rising from her teacup. Officially, yes, she said. Sergeant Whitaker was reported killed in action at the Somme. His dog tags were recovered from a compromised body. Margaret felt a familiar wave of grief wash over her, the official confirmation a painful reminder of her loss. But she refused to give up hope. But the telegram, she insisted, her voice trembling slightly. It was from him. I know it. Nightingale leaned forward, her eyes locking with Margaret's. The telegram is intriguing, she admitted. And it does raise certain questions. However, it could also be a deception. A tactic used by the enemy to sow confusion and discord.
But why would they target me?
Margaret asked, her voice filled with confusion. I'm just a woman. A grieving fiancé. Nightingale's expression softened slightly, a flicker of empathy crossing her features. "You were more than that to Sergeant Whitaker, Miss Hayes," she said. "You were his anchor, his reason for returning, his weakness." She paused, her gaze hardening again. "The enemy knows this. They may believe that you possess information, secrets that Sergeant Whitaker might have shared with you. Or they may simply be using you as bait to lure him out of hiding, if he is indeed alive." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. The thought of being used as bait, a pawn in a deadly game of espionage, was terrifying. "So what do I do?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Nightingale took a sip of her tea, her eyes never leaving Margaret's.
"You have two choices," she said. "You can walk away.
Forget about the telegram. Accept the official story. Try to rebuild your life. Or," Margaret prompted, her heart pounding in her chest. "Or," Nightingale continued, her voice dropping to a murmur, "you can help me. Help me find out the truth. Help me find out if Sergeant Whitaker is alive, and if so, where he is." It was a dangerous proposition, a leap of faith into a world of shadows and lies. But Margaret didn't hesitate. "I'll do it," she said, her voice firm and unwavering. "I'll do whatever it takes." Nightingale smiled, a faint, knowing smile. "I thought you might," she said. "You have his spirit, Miss Hayes. His courage. His determination." She reached into her handbag, pulling out a small, folded piece of paper. "This is an address," she said, handing it to Margaret. "A safe house in London. Go there. Tell them I sent you. They will provide you with shelter and assistance." "London?" Margaret exclaimed, her eyes widening in surprise. "But how am I supposed to get to London? It's across the ocean, in the middle of a war zone." Nightingale's smile widened slightly. "Leave that to me," she said. "I have connections. I can arrange passage for you. On a ship. A special ship." Margaret felt a surge of adrenaline, a mixture of fear and excitement. She was about to embark on a perilous journey, a voyage across a barricaded sea, into the heart of enemy territory. She was stepping into Henry's world, a world of espionage, deception, and danger. She rose, gathering her belongings. "When do I leave?" she asked, ready for anything, her reservations fading. Nightingale looked at her, her eyes filled with a mixture of admiration and concern.
"Tonight," she said.
"Be ready." The cafe seemed to fade as she stepped from its doorway. The city's sounds muted, everything blurred. It was time. Chapter 7. Echoes in the Trenches. The special ship turned out to be a merchant vessel, the SS Caledonia, ostensibly carrying supplies to England, but with a hidden cargo of intelligence operatives and, now, Margaret Hayes. Nightingale had arranged everything with a swift efficiency that both impressed and unnerved Margaret. A forged passport, a hastily packed suitcase, and a whispered farewell to Mrs. O'Malley, who looked at her with a mixture of bewilderment and terror, and Margaret was on her way. The voyage was a tense and claustrophobic affair. The ship was crowded, the air thick with the smell of salt, sweat, and fear. The constant threat of U-boat attacks hung heavy in the air, and the nights were punctuated by the distant rumble of depth charges, a chilling reminder of the dangers lurking beneath the waves. Margaret spent most of her time in her small, cramped cabin, poring over Henry's letters and journal, searching for any clue, any hint that might shed light on his mission, his whereabouts, or the identity of his enemies. She found nothing concrete, but the exercise served to keep her mind occupied, to distract her from the gnawing fear and uncertainty that threatened to consume her. She befriended a young nurse, Elsie, who was also traveling to England, to work in a military hospital near the front lines. Elsie was a bright, cheerful woman, with a resilience that belied her age. She shared stories of her training, her hopes for the future, and her unwavering belief in the Allied cause. Her optimism was infectious, a small beacon of hope in the surrounding darkness. One evening, as they sat on deck, watching the sun sink below the horizon, Elsie asked Margaret about her reasons for traveling to England. Margaret hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. She couldn't tell Elsie the whole truth, the story of the telegram, the spy ring, the dangerous mission she was embarking on. "I'm looking for someone," she finally said, choosing her words carefully. "Someone I lost." Elsie nodded sympathetically. "A soldier?" she asked. Margaret hesitated again, then nodded.
"Yes," she said.
"A soldier." Elsie reached out and took Margaret's hand, her touch warm and comforting. "I understand," she said. "So many of us have lost someone. So many are searching." She paused, her gaze fixed on the darkening sky. "I lost my brother," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "At Ypres. He was just 19. Margaret felt a pang of empathy for Elsie, a shared sense of loss that transcended their different circumstances. They sat in silence for a while, their hands clasped together, two women bound by the common thread of grief and the unwavering hope for a better future. The ship arrived in Liverpool after 10 grueling days at sea. The city was a hive of activity, bustling with soldiers, sailors, and war workers. The air was thick with the smell of coal smoke and the constant drone of air raid sirens, a stark reminder that England was a nation at war. Margaret made her way to the address Nightingale had given her, a nondescript townhouse in a quiet London neighborhood. She was greeted by a stern-faced woman who introduced herself as Mrs. Davies, the housekeeper. Mrs. Davies eyed her suspiciously, scrutinizing her forged passport with a practiced eye. "Nightingale sent you?" she asked, her voice gruff and unwelcoming. Margaret nodded. "Yes," she said. "She told me to come here." Mrs. Davies grunted, seemingly satisfied. "Very well," she said. "Follow me." She led Margaret through the house, a labyrinth of dimly lit corridors and sparsely furnished rooms. The air was thick with the smell of dust and old books, a sense of secrecy and intrigue hanging heavy in the air. She showed Margaret to a small, but clean room on the second floor, overlooking a quiet courtyard. "You'll be staying here," she said. "Nightingale will contact you when she's ready." Margaret thanked her, and Mrs. Davies left, closing the door behind her with a decisive click. Margaret unpacked her suitcase, her mind racing. She was in London, in the heart of enemy territory, surrounded by strangers, with no idea what the future held. She was completely reliant on Nightingale, a woman she barely knew, a woman who held all the cards. She sat on the edge of the bed, feeling a wave of exhaustion wash over her. The journey had been long and arduous, both physically and emotionally. She closed her eyes, trying to conjure an image of Henry, his smiling face, his warm embrace, the sound of his laughter. But all she saw were shadows. All she heard were whispers. All she felt was a gnawing fear that she might never see him again. Suddenly, a sound startled her. A faint tapping, coming from the wall behind her bed. She listened intently, her heart pounding in her chest. Top, top, top. A pause. Then, tap tap. It was a code. A rhythmic pattern of taps, clearly deliberate, clearly meant for her. She recognized it instantly. It was a code Henry had taught her, a simple system of taps and pauses representing letters of the alphabet. She scrambled out of bed, pressing her ear against the wall. The tapping continued, spelling out a message.
M-A-R-G-A-R-I-T.
Her name. Then another message.
T-R-E-N-C-H-E-S tranche.
The tapping stopped. Margaret stood there, her mind reeling. It was Henry. He was alive. And he was trying to communicate with her. From the trenches. But how? And why? The questions swirled in her mind, a vortex of confusion and hope. She felt a rush, a sense of urgency that made her want to act. But how? Where did she begin? She looked around. There on the desk. A pen and paper. The message hadn't finished. She tapped back, mimicking the code he had taught her. H-E-R-E. She waited, the silence seeming to stretch, a chasm of time. Then, the response came, and her blood turned to ice. Chapter 8. The unsent letter. The answering taps were slow, hesitant, as if the sender were struggling to maintain the rhythm.
D-A-N-G-E-R danger.
The single word, spelled out in the crude code, sent a fresh wave of fear through Margaret. It was a confirmation of everything she'd suspected, everything Nightingale had warned her about. Henry was alive, but he was in grave peril. She tapped back, frantic, desperate for more information.
WHIR?
The response was agonizingly slow, each tap a hammer blow against her fragile hope.
Ako esape primete el hospital.
A hospital? Was he wounded? Captured? Or was it a coded message, a reference to something else entirely? She remembered Elsie, the young nurse she'd met on the ship, heading to a military hospital near the front lines. Could there be a connection? She spent the rest of the night in a state of agitated unrest, her mind racing through a maze of possibilities. She considered contacting Nightingale, but hesitated. She didn't know who to trust, who to believe. Nightingale had helped her get to London, but she was still an enigma, her motives unclear, her loyalties uncertain. At dawn, she decided to take matters into her own hands. She couldn't wait for Nightingale for instructions for permission. She had to find Henry, and she had to do it now. She remembered Elsie mentioning the name of the hospital where she was stationed, St. Jude's Military Hospital, near Amiens in France. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it was the only lead she had. She packed a small bag, taking only the essentials, her forged passport, Henry's letters, a small amount of money, and the telegram that had started it all. She left a note for Mrs. Davies, saying simply that she was going to visit a friend, a vague excuse that she hoped would buy her some time. She made her way to Victoria Station, the air thick with the bustle of wartime London. Soldiers in uniform, their faces grim and determined, rushed to and fro, their boots echoing on the cobblestones. Women in mourning clothes, their eyes red-rimmed with grief, clutched photographs of their loved ones, their faces etched with a mixture of hope and despair. She purchased a ticket to Dover, the port city from which she would attempt to cross the English Channel. The journey was fraught with danger, the waters patrolled by German U-boats, the skies filled with enemy aircraft. But Margaret was undeterred. She had a mission, a purpose, a love that propelled her forward. At Dover, she found a small, battered fishing boat, its captain a grizzled veteran with a weathered face and a cynical eye. He was willing to take her across the channel for a price. A hefty price. Margaret paid him without hesitation, her savings dwindling rapidly, but her determination unwavering. The crossing was terrifying. The small boat was tossed about by the rough seas, the waves crashing over the deck, soaking Margaret to the bone. The constant threat of attack hung heavy in the air, and the night was punctuated by the distant boom of artillery fire, a chilling reminder of the war raging on the other side. They reached the French coast under the cover of darkness, landing in a secluded cove near Calais. Margaret thanked the captain, her legs shaking, her body exhausted, but her spirit unbroken. She made her way inland, hitching rides with sympathetic farmers and soldiers, her forged passport and her carefully crafted story that she was a volunteer nurse heading to St. Jude's proving surprisingly effective. The landscape was devastated, a scarred and broken testament to the horrors of war. Fields were churned into mud, trees were shattered stumps, villages were reduced to rubble. The air was thick with the smell of smoke, decay, and the ever-present stench of death. She finally reached Amiens, a city battered but not broken, its streets filled with soldiers, refugees, and the walking wounded. She found St. Jude's Military Hospital, a sprawling complex of tents and makeshift buildings, overflowing with casualties. The sight that greeted her was overwhelming. Rows upon rows of cots, filled with injured and dying men, their bodies broken, their spirits shattered. The air was thick with the sounds of moaning, crying, and the constant clatter of medical instruments. The smell of blood, antiseptic, and unwashed bodies was overpowering. She approached a harried-looking nurse, her uniform stained with blood, her face etched with exhaustion. "Excuse me," Margaret said, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm looking for a patient. Sergeant Henry Whittaker." The nurse looked at her blankly. "Whittaker?" she repeated. "I don't know the name. We have hundreds of patients. Thousands. Margaret felt the wave of despair wash over her. She'd come so far, risked so much, only to hit a dead end. But then, she remembered Elsie. She asked the nurse if she knew her, describing her as a young, cheerful woman with bright red hair. The nurse's face lit up.
Elsie? She said.
Yes, I know Elsie. She's working in the shell shock ward. Shell shock. The word sent a shiver down Margaret's spine. Could Henry be there? His mind fractured, his memories distorted, his identity lost. She followed the nurse to the shell shock ward, a separate section of the hospital, housed in a large, dimly lit tent. The sounds that emanated from within were even more disturbing than those in the main hospital. Screaming, sobbing, babbling, the sounds of men trapped in their own private hells. She found Elsie, her cheerful demeanor replaced by a grim determination, her eyes shadowed with a weariness that spoke of the horrors she'd witnessed. "Margaret?" Elsie exclaimed, surprised to see her. What are you doing here?" Margaret explained her situation, the telegram, the tapping on the wall, the desperate search for Henry. Elsie listened intently, her expression shifting from surprise to concern to a dawning realization. "There's a patient," she said, her voice low and hesitant. "He doesn't have a name. He was brought in a few weeks ago. Unconscious. No identification. Just a scrap of paper. In his pocket." Elsie reached into her pocket, pulling out a small, crumpled piece of paper. It was a letter, torn and stained with blood, but still legible. It was addressed to Margaret, in Henry's familiar handwriting. It was the last letter he had written to her, the one he had never sent, the one Samuel had supposedly delivered. Elsie spoke softly.
"He won't speak. He won't eat.
He just stares. But sometimes." Elsie choked back a sob. "Sometimes I see him, tapping on the wall." Margaret knew. She knew she had found him. Chapter 9. Beneath a Sky of Fire. The unsent letter, clutched in Elsie's hand, was a tangible link to Henry, a whisper of his presence in this chaotic, war-torn world. Margaret's heart pounded in her chest, a mixture of hope, fear, and a desperate longing to see him, to touch him, to know that he was truly alive. Elsie led her through the shell shock ward, a labyrinth of cots and makeshift dividers, each holding a man lost in his own private torment. The air was thick with the sounds of suffering, the smells of unwashed bodies and antiseptic, a grim testament to the psychological toll of war. They reached a small, secluded corner of the tent, where a single cot sat isolated from the others. A figure lay on the cot, his back to them, his body still and unmoving. His dark hair, matted with sweat and dirt, curled at the nape of his neck, a detail so familiar, so achingly Henry, that Margaret felt a lump rise in her throat. "He doesn't respond to anything," Elsie whispered, her voice filled with a mixture of pity and concern. "He just stares. At the wall. Or at nothing." Margaret approached the cot slowly, her legs trembling, her heart pounding in her chest. She reached out a hand, hesitating for a moment, then gently touched his shoulder. "Henry?" she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Henry, it's me. Margaret." He didn't respond. He didn't move. He didn't even seem to notice her presence. She knelt beside the cot, her gaze fixed on his face. It was him. It was Henry. But he was different. His eyes, usually so bright and full of life, were vacant, unfocused, staring blankly at the canvas wall of the tent. His face was pale and drawn, his cheeks hollow, his lips cracked and dry. He was thinner than she remembered, his body wasted, his muscles atrophied. She took his hand, her fingers interlacing with his. His skin was cold, clammy, his grip weak and unresponsive. But it was his hand, the hand that had held hers countless times, the hand that had written her love letters, the hand that had promised to return. "Henry," she said again, her voice stronger this time, her determination unwavering. "It's me, Margaret. I'm here. I've come for you." A flicker of something, a spark of recognition, seemed to pass through his eyes. He turned his head slightly, his gaze shifting towards her, but his focus remained distant, unfocused. "Margaret?" he whispered, his voice raspy and weak, barely audible above the din of the ward. It was him. He remembered her. He knew her name. Tears streamed down Margaret's face, tears of relief, of joy, of a love that had endured the ravages of war, the separation of distance, the deception of death. "Yes, Henry," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "It's me. I'm here." She leaned closer, pressing her forehead against his, her tears mingling with the sweat and dirt on his skin. She held him close, whispering words of comfort, of love, of reassurance. He didn't speak again. He didn't move. But she felt a slight pressure in his hand, a faint squeeze, a silent acknowledgement of her presence. Elsie watched them, her eyes filled with tears. He hasn't responded to anyone," she whispered. "Until now." Margaret stayed with Henry for hours, talking to him, singing to him, reading to him from his old letters, trying to reach through the fog of his trauma, to reconnect with the man she loved. She told him about her journey, about the telegram, about Nightingale, about her unwavering belief that he was alive. Slowly, gradually, he began to respond. A flicker of recognition in his eyes, a slight movement of his head, a faint whisper of his voice. He was still lost, still trapped in his own private hell, but he was present. He was with her. As night fell, the sounds of the ward subsided, replaced by the distant rumble of artillery fire, a constant reminder of the war raging just beyond the walls of the hospital. The sky above Amiens was lit by flashes of light, the explosions painting a macabre canvas of fire and destruction. Margaret lay beside Henry on the narrow cot, holding him close, her body shielding him from the noise, the fear, the chaos of the outside world. She whispered promises of a future, of a life beyond the war, of a love that would endure. Suddenly, he spoke, his voice clear and strong, as if the fog had lifted, momentarily, from his mind. They know, he said, his eyes fixed on the ceiling of the tent. "They know I'm here." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. "Who, Henry?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Who knows?" He struggled to speak, his body shaking with the effort. "The spies," he whispered. "The Nightingale betrayed me." Nightingale? Betrayed him? The revelation sent a shockwave through Margaret. The woman who had helped her, guided her, sent her to London, was she the enemy all along? "They're coming," Henry continued, his voice rising in panic. "They're coming for me." He clutched Margaret's hand, his grip surprisingly strong. "You have to go," he whispered, his eyes filled with a desperate plea. "You have to get out of here." Before Margaret could respond, a commotion erupted outside the tent. Shouts, screams, the sound of running feet. The spies. They were here. Margaret knew she had to act quickly. She had to get Henry out of the hospital, away from danger, before it was too late. She had to protect him, even if it meant risking her own life. She looked around frantically, searching for an escape route. The tent was surrounded, the exits blocked. There was no way out. Except her gaze fell on a small, canvas flap at the back of the tent, used for ventilation. It was a tight squeeze, but it might be their only chance. "Henry," she whispered, her voice urgent. "We have to go. Now." She helped him sit up, his body weak and unsteady. She wrapped his arm around her shoulders, supporting his weight as they stumbled towards the back of the tent. The sounds of the commotion grew louder, closer. They were running out of time. Margaret ripped open the canvas flap, creating a small opening. She pushed Henry through, urging him to crawl, to move, to escape. He hesitated, his eyes filled with fear, with confusion, with a desperate plea for her to stay. "Go, Henry," she said, her voice firm and unwavering. "I'll be right behind you." It was a lie and a promise. He crawled through the opening, disappearing into the darkness outside. Margaret followed, squeezing through the tight space, her heart pounding in her chest. They ran into the night, the sounds of pursuit echoing around them. Chapter 10. A stolen moment in Amiens. The night air was cold and damp, heavy with the smell of smoke and gunpowder. Margaret and Henry stumbled through the darkness, their escape a desperate flight from unseen enemies. The sounds of pursuit shouts, running feet, the occasional burst of gunfire echoed behind them, spurring them onward. Henry, weakened by his trauma and his injuries, struggled to keep pace. Margaret, fueled by adrenaline and a fierce determination to protect him, half carried, half dragged him through the deserted streets of Amiens, seeking refuge in the shadows, in the bombed-out buildings, in the maze of alleyways that crisscrossed the city. They found temporary shelter in the ruins of a church, its roof shattered by artillery fire, its stained glass windows reduced to jagged fragments. The air inside was cold and damp, the silence broken only by the distant rumble of war and the ragged breathing of the two fugitives. They huddled together in a corner, beneath a crumbling archway, their bodies trembling with exhaustion and fear. Margaret wrapped her arms around Henry, trying to warm him, to comfort him, to reassure him that they would be safe.
Who were they?
Henry whispered, his voice raspy and weak. The men in the hospital? Margaret hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. She didn't want to frighten him, to add to his already overwhelming trauma. But she knew she had to tell him the truth, at least part of it. They were spies, Henry, she said, her voice low and steady. The ones you were investigating. The ones who betrayed you. He looked at her, his eyes filled with confusion and a flicker of recognition. Nightingale?
He whispered.
Margaret nodded, her heart heavy with the weight of the betrayal. Yes, Henry, she said. Nightingale. He closed his eyes, his body shaking with a mixture of anger and despair. I trusted her, he whispered. I believed in her. Margaret held him closer, her tears mingling with the dust and grime on his face. She understood his pain, his sense of betrayal. She felt it too. We can't trust anyone, Henry, she said, her voice firm and unwavering. Except each other. They sat in silence for a while, their bodies huddled together, their hearts beating in unison. The distant sounds of war seemed to fade, replaced by the gentle rhythm of their breathing, the shared warmth of their bodies, the unspoken language of their love. It was a stolen moment, a brief respite from the chaos and danger that surrounded them, a reminder of the life they had lost, the life they hoped to reclaim. Margaret looked at Henry, his face pale and drawn in the dim light, his eyes closed, his body exhausted. She traced the lines of his face with her fingertips, her touch gentle and loving. She remembered the man he had been, the strong, confident, vibrant man she had fallen in love with. And she knew, with a certainty that defied all logic, all reason, that he was still there, somewhere beneath the surface of his trauma, waiting to be found, waiting to be healed. She leaned closer, pressing her lips against his forehead, her kiss a silent promise, a vow to protect him, to love him, to help him find his way back to her. He stirred, his eyes flickering open. He looked at her, his gaze unfocused, but filled with a flicker of recognition, a spark of the man he once was. Margaret? He whispered, his voice barely audible. Yes, Henry, she said, her voice choked with emotion. It's me. I'm here. He reached out a hand, his fingers tracing the lines of her face, his touch hesitant but tender. You came for me, he whispered. Margaret nodded, tears streaming down her face. I'll always come for you, Henry, she said. Always. He smiled, a faint, fleeting smile, but a smile nonetheless. It was the first genuine smile she'd seen on his face since she'd found him in the hospital, a sign of hope, a flicker of the man he once was. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated love, a connection that transcended the horrors of war, the separation of distance, the deception of death. It was a stolen moment, a treasure to be cherished, a memory to be held close. But the moment couldn't last. The reality of their situation, the danger that surrounded them, intruded upon their fragile sanctuary. The sounds of pursuit grew closer, the shouts more distinct, the threat more imminent. They had to move. They had to escape. They had to find a safe haven, a place where they could hide, where they could heal, where they could plan their next move. Margaret helped Henry to his feet, his body weak and unsteady. They left the ruins of the church, stepping back into the darkness, into the war-torn streets of Amiens, their future uncertain, their love their only weapon. They needed to find help, real help, and they needed it soon. The sky was already beginning to lighten, the promise of a new day filled not with hope, but with increased danger. Chapter 11. The Spy's Revelation. The pre-dawn light cast long, eerie shadows across the war-ravaged streets of Amiens. Margaret and Henry, their bodies weary, their spirits tested, moved like phantoms through the rubble-strewn landscape. The sounds of their pursuers, though fainter now, still echoed in their ears, a constant reminder of the peril they faced. Henry, leaning heavily on Margaret, struggled to keep pace. His mind, though clearer than before, was still shrouded in a fog of trauma, his memories fragmented, his thoughts disjointed. Margaret, her own strength waning, drew upon a reservoir of determination fueled by her love for him, her unwavering commitment to his safety. They needed a plan, a refuge, a way to escape the clutches of Nightingale's network. Margaret remembered Elsie, the young nurse at St. Jude's. Elsie had been kind, compassionate, and surprisingly resourceful. She might be their only hope. But returning to the hospital was too risky. Nightingale's spies would be watching, waiting for them to make a move. They needed a way to contact Elsie without revealing their location, without exposing themselves to danger. As they huddled in the doorway of a bombed-out bakery, a glimmer of an idea sparked in Margaret's mind. She remembered the coded messages Henry had used, the tapping on the wall. Could they use the same system to communicate with Elsie? She explained her plan to Henry, her voice low and urgent. He listened intently, his eyes flickering with a mixture of understanding and doubt. He was weak, his concentration fractured, but he grasped the essence of the idea. They found a piece of loose brick in the bakery wall, a section that resonated with a hollow sound when tapped. Margaret began to tap, slowly, deliberately, spelling out Elsie's name in the code Henry had taught her.
Elsie.
She paused, listening intently. Silence. She repeated the message, her heart pounding in her chest. Still nothing. Despair began to creep in, the chilling realization that their desperate attempt might fail. But she refused to give up. She tapped again, louder this time, her knuckles raw against the rough brick.
Elsie.
Then faintly, almost imperceptibly, a response.
Top.
It was Elsie. She had heard them. She was listening. Margaret quickly tapped out a message, explaining their situation, their escape from the hospital, their desperate need for help. She gave their location, the bombed-out bakery, and pleaded with Elsie to come alone, to trust no one. She finished the message, her hand trembling, her body exhausted. They waited, their breaths held, their ears straining for any sound, any sign of Elsie's approach. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The sky began to lighten, the darkness receding, revealing the full extent of the city's devastation. The sounds of war, the distant rumble of artillery, the occasional burst of gunfire seemed to intensify, a constant reminder of the dangers that lurked around every corner. Just as Margaret's hope began to dwindle, a figure emerged from the shadows, a young woman dressed in a nurse's uniform, her red hair a beacon in the gray dawn. It was Elsie. She rushed towards them, her face etched with concern. "Margaret! Henry!" she exclaimed, her voice a mixture of relief and anxiety. "Are you all right?" Margaret nodded, tears of relief streaming down her face. "We're alive," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "But they're after us. Nightingale's spies." Elsie's eyes widened in alarm. "Nightingale?" she repeated. "But she's a traitor," Margaret finished, her voice bitter. "She betrayed Henry. She set him up." Elsie looked at Henry, his face pale and drawn, his eyes filled with a mixture of confusion and fear. She reached out and took his hand, her touch gentle and reassuring. "We have to get you out of here," she said, her voice firm and determined. "I know a place. A safe house. Used by the resistance." The resistance. Another layer of intrigue, another clandestine network operating in the shadows of war. Margaret had heard whispers of the French resistance, brave men and women fighting against the German occupation, risking their lives to sabotage the enemy, to help Allied soldiers, to keep the flame of freedom alive. Elsie led them through a maze of back alleys and hidden passageways, avoiding the main streets, staying out of sight. She moved with a confidence and knowledge that surprised Margaret, revealing a hidden side to the young nurse, a resourcefulness honed by the harsh realities of war. They reached a small, unassuming house, its windows boarded up, its door reinforced with steel. Elsie knocked on the door in a specific pattern, a coded signal that identified them as allies. The door opened a crack, revealing a man with a weathered face and wary eyes. He scrutinized them carefully, his hand resting on a pistol tucked into his belt. "Elsie?" he said, his voice gruff and suspicious. "It's me, Jean-Luc," Elsie replied, her voice calm and reassuring. "I have friends. They need our help." Jean-Luc hesitated, his gaze fixed on Margaret and Henry. He saw the desperation in their eyes, the exhaustion etched on their faces, the silent plea for sanctuary. He opened the door wider, allowing them to enter.
"Come in," he said. "Quickly."
They stepped inside, into a dimly lit room, sparsely furnished but clean. The air was thick with the smell of stale tobacco and something else, something metallic, something that reminded Margaret of gunpowder. Jean-Luc closed and bolted the door, his movements swift and decisive. He turned to face them, his eyes still wary, but softened by a flicker of compassion.
"Who are you?"
he asked, his gaze fixed on Margaret. "And why are you being hunted?" Margaret hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. She didn't know Jean-Luc, didn't know if she could trust him. But she had no other choice. She had to trust Elsie's judgment, her faith in this man, in this network of resistance fighters. She started at the beginning with the telegram and told him everything. Jean-Luc listened intently, his expression unchanging, his eyes never leaving Margaret's face. When she finished, he remained silent for a moment, his gaze shifting to Henry, who sat slumped in a chair, his head in his hands, his body trembling. "Nightingale," he muttered, his voice filled with a mixture of anger and disgust. "I know the name. A dangerous woman. A master manipulator.
A spy."
He paused, his gaze returning to Margaret. "You're lucky to be alive," he said. "Both of you." He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small, crumpled piece of paper. It was a photograph, a black and white image of a woman. A woman Margaret recognized instantly. It was Nightingale, but she was younger, her hair a different style, her clothes less elegant. And she was standing next to a man in a German uniform. "This was taken years ago," Jean-Luc said, his voice low and bitter. "Before the war."
"In Berlin."
He looked at Margaret, his eyes filled with a chilling revelation. "Nightingale," he said, "is not who you think she is. She's not British. She's German." The revelation hit like a physical blow. It spun the room. Nightingale was not a double agent. She had played only one side, the wrong side. Chapter 12. Fractured Trust. The photograph, a faded relic from a pre-war Berlin, shattered Margaret's perception of reality. Nightingale, the woman who had posed as a British intelligence officer, the woman who had orchestrated Henry's mission, the woman who had seemingly helped Margaret was a German spy. The revelation was a seismic shift, a betrayal that cut deeper than any physical wound. "But how?" Margaret stammered, her voice barely a whisper. She spoke perfect English. She knew everything about British intelligence. She was trained, Jean-Luc replied, his voice grim. Years of preparation. Infiltration at the highest levels. She played her part flawlessly. Until now. He looked at Henry, his eyes filled with a mixture of pity and understanding. Sergeant Whittaker, he said, was her most valuable asset. He was close to uncovering a network of German spies operating within the Allied forces. He had to be silenced. But she underestimated him. She underestimated his resilience. And she underestimated you, Miss Hayes. Margaret felt a surge of anger, a burning resentment towards Nightingale, towards the deception, the manipulation, the danger she had placed Henry in. But beneath the anger, a flicker of fear remained. If Nightingale was German, then her network was far more extensive, far more dangerous than they had imagined. "We have to warn someone," Margaret said, her voice urgent. "British intelligence. The War Office. Someone has to know." Jean-Luc shook his head. "It's too risky," he said. "Nightingale has eyes and ears everywhere. She likely has moles within British intelligence. We can't trust anyone." "But we can't just do nothing," Margaret protested. "She's still out there. She's still a threat." Jean-Luc nodded, his expression thoughtful.
"We need a plan," he said.
"A way to expose her. A way to stop her. But we need to be careful. Very careful." He turned to Elsie, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Elsie," he said. "You did well. You brought them to safety." Elsie smiled, a faint, weary smile. "I couldn't leave them," she said. "They needed help." Jean-Luc turned back to Margaret and Henry.
"You can stay here," he said. "For now.
You'll be safe here. But we need to figure out what to do next." They spent the rest of the day in the safe house, a haven from the storm raging outside. Jean-Luc provided them with food, water, and clean clothes. He tended to Henry's wounds, both physical and psychological, his touch gentle and surprisingly skilled. Henry, though still weak and disoriented, began to show signs of improvement. He spoke more, his memories gradually returning, his thoughts becoming clearer. He remembered his mission, his investigation, his growing suspicion of Nightingale. He remembered Margaret, his love for her, his unwavering faith in her. "I knew you'd come," he whispered, his voice raspy but filled with emotion. "I never lost hope." Margaret held him close, her tears mingling with his. "I'll never leave you, Henry," she said. "Never." As night fell, Jean-Luc gathered them around a small, flickering candle, the only source of light in the dimly lit room. He spread out a map of France on the table, his finger tracing the lines of the front, the locations of Allied and German forces. "Nightingale's network is extensive," he said. "She has spies in every major city, every military installation, every government office. She's been gathering information, sabotaging operations, sowing discord and confusion." "But what's her ultimate goal?" Margaret asked. "What's she trying to achieve?" Jean-Luc hesitated, his gaze fixed on the map. "I believe," he said, his voice low and serious, "that she's preparing for something big. Something that could change the course of the war." He pointed to a location on the map, a small town near the front lines. "Verdun," he said. "I believe she's planning an attack. A major offensive. To break through the Allied lines. To cripple the French army."
"Verdun."
The name sent a shiver down Margaret's spine. It was a place of legend, a symbol of French resistance, a battlefield where hundreds of thousands of soldiers had died in one of the bloodiest battles of the war. "We have to stop her," Margaret said, her voice filled with determination. "We have to warn the Allied forces. We have to prevent another slaughter."
Jean-Luc nodded.
"But how?" he asked. "We have no proof. No evidence. Just a photograph. And the word of a shell-shocked soldier." He looked at Henry, his eyes filled with a mixture of respect and concern. "Sergeant Whittaker," he said, "can you remember anything else? Anything that could help us? Any names? Any locations? Any details about Nightingale's plan?" Henry struggled to focus, his mind still clouded by trauma. He closed his eyes, his brow furrowed in concentration. He muttered a few words, fragmented memories, disjointed thoughts. Then he spoke, his voice clear and strong, as if a veil had been lifted from his mind. "The clock," he said. "The clock in Amiens." "The clock?" Margaret and Jean-Luc exchanged puzzled glances. "What clock? What did it mean?" Henry continued, his voice gaining strength. "The clock tower," he said, "in the town square. It's a signal, a meeting place." He paused, his breathing becoming labored. "They meet there," he said. "Every night. At midnight. Midnight. The witching hour. A time of secrets, of shadows, of clandestine meetings." Jean-Luc's eyes lit up. "The clock tower," he said. "Of course. It's a perfect location. Central, visible, unsuspecting. He looked at Margaret, his expression determined.
We have a chance, he said.
A chance to catch them. A chance to expose Nightingale. A chance to stop her plan. He paused, his gaze shifting to Henry. But it's risky, he said. Very risky. We'll be walking into a trap. We could be outnumbered. Outgunned. We could be killed. He looked at Margaret, his eyes filled with a question. Are you willing to take that risk?
He asked.
Margaret didn't hesitate. She looked at Henry, his face pale but determined, his eyes filled with a flicker of the man he once was. She thought of the soldiers, the innocent lives that were at stake, the future of the war. Yes, she said, her voice firm and unwavering. I'm ready. The decision was made. But as they prepared, one doubt nagged at Margaret.
She had to know.
She turned to Jean-Luc, her gaze locking, needing the truth. Jean-Luc, how did you know about the photograph? About Nightingale in Berlin? A shadow crossed his face, because I was the one who took it. He was the only other choice. He was N. Chapter 13. The weight of his past. Jean-Luc's revelation that he was N. Henry's initial contact. The photographer of the damning image of Nightingale in Berlin hung heavy in the air, a silent testament to the intricate web of secrets and betrayals that permeated the war. It explained his knowledge, his resources, his connection to the resistance, but it also raised new questions, new uncertainties. Why didn't you tell me before? Margaret asked, her voice a mixture of confusion and hurt. Why keep it a secret? Jean-Luc sighed, his gaze fixed on the flickering candle flame, his face etched with the weight of his past. Trust is a precious commodity in this war, Miss Hayes, he said. Especially in my line of work. I had to be sure. Sure of you. Sure of Sergeant Whittaker. Sure of Elsie. He paused, his eyes meeting Margaret's. I was burned before, he said. By someone I trusted. Someone I thought was a friend. Someone who betrayed me. To Nightingale. He revealed a story of his own, a tale of espionage, deception, and loss that mirrored Henry's, but with a deeper, more personal connection to the German spy. He had been a young intelligence officer, working undercover in Berlin, gathering information on the rising Nazi movement. He had met Nightingale, then known by her real name, Ilse Schmidt, a beautiful, intelligent woman who seemed to share his ideals, his opposition to the growing threat of fascism. They had become close, sharing secrets, sharing dreams, sharing a love that transcended national boundaries. He had trusted her, believed in her, confided in her. He had even introduced her to his network of contacts, his fellow spies, his friends. Then, she had betrayed him. She had exposed his network, revealed his identity, handed him over to the Gestapo. He had barely escaped with his life, forced to flee Germany, leaving behind everything he knew, everything he loved. He had spent years rebuilding his life, joining the French resistance, fighting against the Nazi regime, seeking revenge against the woman who had shattered his world. He had adopted the codename N, a symbol of his past, a reminder of his betrayal, a vow to never again be caught off guard. He had been tracking Nightingale ever since, following her movements, uncovering her network, waiting for the opportunity to expose her, to bring her to justice. Henry's investigation had provided that opportunity, a chance to finally settle the score, to avenge the lives she had ruined, the love she had destroyed. I understand, Margaret said, her voice softening. I understand why you didn't trust me, why you kept your secrets. She felt a kinship with Jean-Luc, a shared sense of betrayal, a common bond forged in the crucible of war. They were both victims of Nightingale's deception, both scarred by her treachery, both determined to see her brought to justice. We'll do this together, Margaret said, her voice firm and unwavering. We'll expose her. We'll stop her plan. We'll avenge the lives she's destroyed. Jean-Luc nodded, his eyes filled with a renewed sense of determination.
Tonight, he said.
At midnight. We'll meet them at the clock tower. We'll catch them in the act. And we'll bring them down. They spent the remaining hours preparing for the confrontation, going over the plan, checking their weapons, steeling their nerves. Jean-Luc provided Margaret with a small pistol, a weapon she had never held before, but one she now accepted with a grim determination. She was no longer just a grieving fiancée, a woman searching for her lost love. She was a fighter, a participant in a deadly game of espionage, a warrior in a war that had consumed her world. Henry, though still weak, insisted on joining them. He refused to be left behind, to be protected, to be treated as an invalid. He was a soldier, a spy, a man with a mission. He had to face Nightingale, to confront his betrayer, to reclaim his honor. As the hour approached midnight, they made their way to the town square, their hearts pounding in their chests, their senses heightened, their bodies tense with anticipation. The square was deserted, the buildings shrouded in darkness, the only sound the gentle ticking of the clock tower, a relentless reminder of the approaching deadline. They positioned themselves strategically, hidden in the shadows, watching the clock tower, waiting for Nightingale and her associates to arrive. Jean-Luc, armed with a rifle, took up a position on the roof of a nearby building, providing cover and a clear view of the square. Elsie, her nursing skills now a valuable asset, remained hidden nearby, ready to provide medical assistance if needed. Margaret and Henry, armed with pistols, concealed themselves in the doorway of a bombed-out shop, directly across from the clock tower. They held each other close, their bodies trembling, their breaths mingling in the cold night air. "Are you ready?" Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible. Henry nodded, his eyes fixed on the clock tower, his face grim and determined. "I have to be," he said, his voice raspy but firm. The clock began to chime, its deep, resonant tones echoing through the deserted square. 12 times. Midnight. As the final chime faded, figures began to emerge from the shadows, converging on the clock tower. Margaret recognized Nightingale instantly, her elegant figure, her confident stride, her face a mask of cold calculation. She was accompanied by several men, their faces obscured by the darkness, their bodies tense with anticipation. The trap was set. The prey had arrived. The confrontation was about to begin. Margaret raised her pistol. "It's now or never," she whispered. A moment passed. Then, from the shadows, stepped another figure. One that changed everything. Chapter 14. A flicker of hope. The figure that emerged from the shadows was not one of Nightingale's henchmen, not a German spy, not an enemy combatant. It was Samuel. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. Samuel? What was he doing here? Had he followed them? Had he betrayed them to Nightingale? Or was he, too, a victim of the German spy's intricate web of deception? He walked slowly towards the clock tower, his hands raised in a gesture of peace, his face pale and drawn, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. He stopped a few feet from Nightingale, his body silhouetted against the faint glow of the moon. "Ilse," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "It's over. They know. They know everything." Nightingale. Ilse turned to face him, her expression unreadable in the darkness. "Samuel," she said, her voice cold and devoid of emotion. "You shouldn't have come." "I had to," Samuel replied, his voice gaining strength. "I had to warn you. They're going to arrest you. They're going to expose you." Ilse laughed, a harsh, brittle sound that echoed through the deserted square. "You think you can stop me, Samuel?"
she said.
"You think you can betray me, after all I've done for you?" "You used me," Samuel said, his voice filled with anger and regret.
"You manipulated me.
You made me believe in you." He took a step closer, his hands still raised, his eyes pleading. "It's not too late, Ilse," he said. "You can still surrender. You can still tell the truth. You can still save yourself." Ilse's expression hardened.
"You naive fool," she said.
"You think I care about saving myself? You think I care about the truth? I care about one thing, and one thing only. Victory. Victory for the fatherland. Victory for the Reich." She raised her hand, signaling to her men. They stepped forward, their weapons drawn, their faces grim and determined. "Kill him," she ordered, her voice cold and devoid of mercy. "Kill them all." Before the men could react, before they could raise their weapons, Before they could carry out Ilse's orders, Jean-Luc's rifle cracked, the shot echoing through the square. One of Ilse's men fell to the ground, his body convulsing, his life extinguished in an instant. Chaos erupted. Gunfire filled the air, bullets whizzing through the darkness, ricocheting off the stone walls of the clock tower. Margaret and Henry, caught in the crossfire, ducked for cover, their hearts pounding in their chests, their bodies tense with adrenaline. Samuel, realizing the danger, threw himself to the ground, crawling towards Margaret and Henry, seeking refuge in the doorway of the bombed-out shop. "Margaret!" he shouted, his voice barely audible above the din of gunfire.
I'm sorry.
"I didn't know. I swear." Margaret looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of anger, confusion, and a flicker of forgiveness. She saw the fear in his eyes, the desperation in his voice, the genuine remorse in his expression. She realized that he, too, had been a victim of Ilse's manipulation, a pawn in her deadly game. "It's all right, Samuel," she said, her voice firm and reassuring. "We'll get through this. Together." They huddled together in the doorway, the three of them, united against a common enemy, their past betrayals, their past mistakes, forgiven but not forgotten. Jean-Luc, from his vantage point on the rooftop, continued to fire, his shots precise and deadly. He took down another of Ilse's men, then another, his rifle a beacon of resistance in the darkness. Elsie, her nursing skills now invaluable, tended to the wounded, her courage and compassion unwavering. The battle raged, a fierce and brutal exchange of gunfire, a desperate struggle for survival. The square, once a symbol of peace and tranquility, was transformed into a battlefield, a scene of chaos and destruction. Margaret, her pistol clutched in her trembling hand, fired at the remaining spies, her shots wild and inaccurate, but driven by a fierce determination to protect Henry, to protect Samuel, to protect herself. Henry, despite his weakness, his trauma, his injuries, fought alongside her, his pistol firing with a surprising accuracy, his aim guided by instinct, by training, by a soldier's resolve. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the clock tower, running towards them, her face illuminated by the flashes of gunfire. It was Ilse. She was escaping. Margaret raised her pistol, her finger on the trigger, her sights fixed on Ilse's fleeing figure. She had a clear shot. She could end it all. She could kill the woman who had betrayed them, who had caused them so much pain, who had threatened their lives. But she hesitated. She couldn't do it. She couldn't take a life, even a life of an enemy. She was a nurse, a caregiver, a woman who valued life, who believed in compassion, who sought to heal, not to destroy. She lowered her pistol, her hand trembling, her heart heavy with a mixture of relief and regret. Ilse disappeared into the darkness, her escape a bitter pill to swallow, a victory snatched from their grasp. The gunfire subsided, the silence broken only by the moans of the wounded, the ragged breathing of the survivors, the distant sirens of approaching reinforcements. The battle was over. They had survived. But they had not won. Ilse had escaped. And the war raged on. As the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, painting the sky with hues of pink and orange, Margaret, Henry, Samuel, Elsie, and Jean-Luc stood amongst the wreckage of the square, their faces etched with exhaustion, their bodies bruised and battered, their spirits tested but unbroken. A flicker of hope, fragile but real, ignited within them. They had faced death, betrayal, and despair, but they had also found courage, resilience, and love. They would continue to fight, to resist, to seek justice, until the war was won, until peace was restored, until they could finally rebuild their shattered lives. But one question remained, haunting them. Where would Ilse go? Chapter 15. The Rendezvous Point. Ilse's escape cast a long shadow over their hard-won survival. The knowledge that she was still at large, still plotting, still a threat, tempered their relief with a gnawing sense of unease. The victory felt hollow, incomplete. "She'll have a contingency plan," Jean-Luc said, his voice grim, as they regrouped in the safe house. a rendezvous point, a place to regroup, to rearm, to continue her mission.
But where?
Margaret asked, her mind racing through the possibilities. How do we find her? Henry, though still weak, his voice raspy, spoke up. The clock, he said, his eyes fixed on a distant point, his memory returning in fragments. She mentioned a clock. Not Amiens. Another clock. Another clock. Another coded message. Another piece of the puzzle. Which clock, Henry? Margaret urged, her voice gentle but insistent. Can you remember? He struggled to focus, his brow furrowed in concentration, his body trembling with the effort. Big clock, he muttered. Famous clock. London. London. The city Margaret had fled, the city where Nightingale had woven her web of deception, the city where Henry's mission had begun. It made a twisted kind of sense. Ilsa would return to her base of operations, to her network of contacts, to her source of power. Big Ben, Jean-Luc said, his eyes widening in realization. She's going to London. To Big Ben.
But why?
Elsie asked, her voice filled with confusion. What's there? What's she planning? I don't know, Jean-Luc admitted. But I have a feeling it's something big. Something that could change the course of the war. He looked at Margaret, his expression determined. We have to go to London, he said. We have to stop her. Before it's too late. Margaret nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew the risks, the dangers, the long journey ahead. But she also knew that she couldn't stand idly by, that she couldn't allow Ilsa to continue her reign of terror. She had to fight, for Henry, for herself, for the future. We'll go together, she said, her voice firm and unwavering. All of us. Samuel, his face pale but resolute, nodded in agreement. I'm with you, he said. I owe it to Henry. I owe it to everyone. Elsie, her nursing skills now a vital asset, also agreed.
I'll go, she said.
Someone needs to tend to the wounded, and I want to help. Jean-Luc, his experience and his connections invaluable, would lead the way. He had contacts in the resistance, in the British intelligence community, who could help them navigate the dangerous landscape of wartime London. They spent the next few hours preparing for the journey, gathering supplies, arranging transportation, contacting their allies. Jean-Luc, using his network of contacts, secured passage on a small, fast boat, a vessel used by the resistance to smuggle agents and supplies across the English Channel. The journey was perilous, the waters patrolled by German U-boats, the skies filled with enemy aircraft. But they were determined, driven by a shared purpose, a common goal, to stop Ilsa, to end her reign of terror, to bring her to justice. They reached the English coast under the cover of darkness, landing in a secluded cove, their arrival unnoticed, their presence a secret. They made their way to London, a city transformed by war, its streets filled with soldiers, its buildings scarred by bombing raids, its people living under a constant threat of attack. They found refuge in a safe house, similar to the one in Amiens, a hidden sanctuary in the heart of the city. Jean-Luc contacted his allies in British intelligence, sharing his information, his suspicions, his warning about Ilsa's plan. But his warning was met with skepticism, with disbelief, with resistance. Nightingale had been a trusted agent, a valued asset, a hero in the eyes of many. The idea that she was a German spy, a traitor, was too much for some to accept. We need proof, the British intelligence officer said. Concrete evidence. Something more than the word of a resistance fighter. And a shell-shocked soldier. Jean-Luc, frustrated by their intransigence, their blindness, their refusal to see the truth, argued his case, pleaded with them to listen, to act, to prevent a catastrophe. But his pleas fell on deaf ears. The wheels of bureaucracy turned slowly, the machinery of government resistant to change, to disruption, to anything that challenged the established order. They were on their own. They had to find Ilsa themselves, to stop her plan, to expose her treachery, before it was too late. They knew she would be at Big Ben.
But when?
And what was she planning? They had to find out. They had to be ready. As the clock ticked down, as the hours passed, as the tension mounted, Margaret, Henry, Samuel, Elsie and Jean-Luc prepared for their final confrontation, their final showdown with the woman who had betrayed them all. They were a small, unlikely band of heroes, united by courage, by love, by a shared sense of justice. They were ready to face the darkness, to fight for the light, to risk everything for a chance to save the world. They decided, together, that they would go at midnight, that very night. They had one chance, and only a few hours to prepare. It was time. Chapter 16. Betrayal's Shadow. Midnight in London. The city held its breath, shrouded in a wartime blackout, the only illumination coming from the faint glow of the moon and the distant flashes of anti-aircraft fire. Big Ben, its iconic silhouette looming large against the night sky, stood silent, its chimes temporarily suspended to avoid aiding enemy bombers. Margaret, Henry, Samuel, Elsie, and Jean-Luc approached the clock tower cautiously, their movements stealthy, their senses heightened. They were a small, ragtag group, armed with a motley collection of weapons and a shared determination to stop Ilsa, to prevent whatever catastrophic plan she had in motion. They positioned themselves strategically, hidden in the shadows of nearby buildings, their eyes fixed on the base of the clock tower, waiting for any sign of Ilsa, any indication of her presence. Jean-Luc, his rifle at the ready, took up a position on a rooftop, providing overwatch and a clear line of sight. Elsie, her medical kit close at hand, remained hidden in a nearby alleyway, prepared to treat any injuries. Margaret, Henry, and Samuel, armed with pistols, concealed themselves in the doorway of a darkened shop, directly across from the entrance to the clock tower. They held each other close, their bodies trembling, their breaths mingling in the cold night air. "Are you sure about this?" Henry whispered, his voice raspy, his body still weak from his ordeal. Margaret nodded, her gaze fixed on the clock tower, her heart pounding in her chest. "We have to, Henry," she said. "We have no choice." Samuel, his face pale but resolute, stood beside them, his pistol gripped tightly in his hand. "We're in this together," he said. "To the end." The silence stretched, taut and heavy, broken only by the distant sounds of the city, the wail of air raid sirens, the rumble of passing trucks, the occasional burst of gunfire. Then, a figure emerged from the shadows, approaching the base of the clock tower. It was Ilsa. She was alone, dressed in a dark coat and hat, her face obscured by the darkness. She walked with a confident stride, her movements purposeful, her demeanor betraying no hint of fear or hesitation. She reached the entrance to the clock tower, paused for a moment, and then disappeared inside. Margaret, Henry, and Samuel exchanged glances, their hearts pounding in unison. It was time. They moved quickly, crossing the open space between the shop and the clock tower, their footsteps silent on the pavement. They reached the entrance, their pistols raised, their bodies tense with anticipation. Margaret pushed open the heavy wooden door, and they stepped inside. The interior of the clock tower was dark and cavernous, the air thick with the smell of dust and old machinery. The only light came from the faint glow of the moon filtering through the high, arched windows. They moved slowly, cautiously, their footsteps echoing in the vast space. They climbed the winding staircase, their pistols leading the way, their senses alert for any sign of danger. They reached a landing, a large, open area filled with the massive gears and mechanisms that powered the clock. And there, standing in the center of the room, surrounded by her henchmen, was Ilsa. She turned to face them, a faint smile playing on her lips, her eyes gleaming with a mixture of triumph and disdain. "Welcome," she said, her voice echoing through the chamber. "I've been expecting you." Margaret, Henry, and Samuel raised their pistols, aiming at Ilsa, their fingers on the triggers. But before they could fire, before they could react, a voice spoke from behind them. "Drop your weapons," the voice commanded, cold and authoritative. They turned, their hearts sinking, their hopes dashed. Standing in the doorway, blocking their escape, was Jean-Luc. His rifle was aimed not at Ilsa, but at them.
"Jean-Luc?"
Margaret exclaimed, her voice filled with disbelief and horror. What are you doing?" Jean-Luc's expression was unreadable, his eyes devoid of emotion.
"I'm sorry, Margaret," he said.
But this is where it ends. He stepped aside, revealing another figure standing behind him. A figure Margaret recognized instantly. A figure she had thought was dead. Sergeant Major Elias Thorne. Thorne? Margaret gasped, her mind reeling, her world collapsing around her. "But you said," Thorne smiled, a cruel, mocking smile. "I lied," he said. "I've been working with Ilsa all along. We've been playing you, Margaret. Playing all of you." It was a double betrayal, a twist of fate so cruel, so unexpected, that it left Margaret speechless, paralyzed, her trust shattered, her hopes crushed. Thorne had been the mastermind, the puppet master, pulling the strings, manipulating them all, leading them into a trap. He had used Margaret's love for Henry, her grief, her determination, to lure them to London, to expose them, to eliminate them. Ilsa stepped forward, her smile widening. "You were so easy to manipulate, Margaret," she said. "So eager to believe, so desperate to find your lost love. You walked right into our trap." She turned to Thorne, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and admiration. "Well done, Elias," she said. "You played your part perfectly." Thorne nodded, his expression smug and self-satisfied. "It was my pleasure, Ilsa," he said. "It's always a pleasure to serve the fatherland." Margaret felt a surge of anger, a burning rage that consumed her, replacing her despair, her fear, her sense of betrayal. She had been played, manipulated, used. But she would not be defeated. She would not surrender. She would not give up. She looked at Henry, his face pale but determined, his eyes filled with a flicker of the man he once was. She looked at Samuel, his expression resolute, his loyalty unwavering. They were outnumbered, outgunned, trapped. But they were not alone. They had each other. And they had their courage, their resilience, their unwavering belief in justice. Margaret raised her pistol, aiming not at Ilsa, not at Thorne, but at the massive gears of the clock mechanism. "If we're going down," she said, her voice firm and unwavering, "we're taking you with us." She fired. Chapter 17. Scars of the Heart. Margaret shot, fired not in anger but in desperate defiance, struck one of the massive gears of the clock mechanism. Sparks flew, metal screeched against metal, and the intricate machinery shuddered, threatening to grind to a halt. The sound, amplified by the cavernous space of the clock tower, was deafening, disorienting, a cacophony of chaos that mirrored the turmoil within Margaret's heart. Ilsa and Thorne, momentarily stunned by Margaret's unexpected act of sabotage, recoiled in surprise. Their carefully laid plans, their intricate web of deception, were unraveling, threatened by a single, desperate act of defiance. "Stop her," Thorne shouted, his voice hoarse with rage. "Kill them all." His henchmen, recovering from their initial shock, raised their weapons, aiming at Margaret, Henry, and Samuel. But before they could fire, a new sound erupted, a sound that changed the dynamic of the confrontation. The chimes of Big Ben. The clock, despite Margaret's shot, despite the damage to its mechanism, began to chime, its deep, resonant tones echoing through the tower, through the city, through the night. It was not midnight. It was not even an even hour. The clock was malfunctioning, its chimes erratic, unpredictable, a symbol of the chaos, the disruption, the unraveling of Ilsa and Thorne's meticulously crafted plan. The sound, unexpected and overwhelming, disoriented Ilsa's henchmen, their aim wavering, their focus disrupted. It was the opportunity Margaret and her companions needed. Samuel, seizing the moment, tackled one of the henchmen, disarming him, wrestling him to the ground. Henry, despite his weakness, his trauma, his injuries, charged at another, his pistol firing, his aim surprisingly true. Margaret, her own pistol still clutched in her hand, turned her attention to Thorne, her eyes filled with a mixture of anger and determination. "You betrayed us," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "You used us. You lied to us." Thorne sneered, his expression contemptuous.
You were fools to trust me, he said.
You were pawns in a game you could never hope to win. He raised his own pistol, aiming at Margaret, his finger on the trigger. But before he could fire, a shot rang out, not from Margaret's pistol, not from Henry's, not from Samuel's. It was Jean-Luc. From his vantage point on the rooftop, he had witnessed the betrayal, the trap, the unfolding chaos. He had waited patiently for the right moment, for the clear shot. And now he had it. His bullet struck Thorne in the shoulder, spinning him around, knocking him off balance. He dropped his pistol, clutching his wounded arm, his face contorted in pain. Margaret, seizing the opportunity, rushed forward, kicking the pistol away from Thorne's reach. She stood over him, her own pistol aimed at his head, her finger on the trigger. She could kill him. She could end his life, avenge his betrayal, eliminate the threat he posed. But she hesitated. She looked at his face, his eyes filled with fear, with pain, with a flicker of regret. She couldn't do it. She couldn't take a life, even the life of a traitor, even the life of a man who had caused her so much pain. She was a nurse, a caregiver, a woman who valued life, who believed in redemption, who sought to heal, not to destroy. She lowered her pistol, her hand trembling, her heart heavy with a mixture of conflicting emotions. "It's over, Thorne," she said, her voice firm but devoid of malice. "You're finished." Meanwhile, the battle raged around them. Samuel, with the help of Elsie, who had bravely entered the fray, subdued the remaining henchmen, their combined strength and determination overcoming the enemy's superior numbers. Henry, his strength returning, his focus sharpening, confronted Ilsa, his pistol aimed at her heart. "It's over, Ilsa," he said, his voice raspy but filled with a newfound resolve. "Surrender." Ilsa looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of hatred and something else. Something that resembled respect? "You were always a worthy opponent, Henry," she said, her voice surprisingly calm. "But you cannot win." She reached into her coat, her hand moving towards a hidden pocket. Henry tightened his grip on his pistol, his finger on the trigger, ready to fire. But before Ilsa could retrieve whatever weapon she concealed, a new sound pierced the chaos. Sirens. The sound of approaching police cars, their sirens wailing, their lights flashing, grew louder, closer, signaling the arrival of reinforcements. Jean-Luc, after firing the shot that wounded Thorne, had contacted his allies in the British intelligence community, alerting them to the situation, providing them with the location, urging them to act. This time they had listened. Ilsa, realizing that she was cornered, that her plan had failed, that her escape was impossible, made a final, desperate move. She pulled a small, silver object from her pocket. A detonator. "If I can't win," she said, her voice filled with a chilling defiance, "then no one can." She pressed the button. Nothing happened. She pressed it again. Still nothing. She looked at the detonator, her expression a mixture of confusion and disbelief. It was inert. Jean-Luc, anticipating Ilsa's final act of destruction, had disabled the detonator, cutting the wires, rendering it harmless. He had foreseen her desperation, her willingness to sacrifice everything, to take everyone down with her. He had, as he always did, outmaneuvered her. The police stormed the clock tower, arresting Ilsa, Thorne, and the remaining henchmen, securing the scene, ending the threat. Margaret, Henry, Samuel, Elsie, and Jean-Luc stood amidst the wreckage, their bodies bruised and battered, their spirits exhausted but triumphant. They had faced betrayal, danger, and death, but they had survived. They had exposed a network of spies, prevented a catastrophic attack, and brought justice to those who had sought to destroy them. But the victory was bittersweet. The scars of betrayal, the wounds of loss, the trauma of war, would remain, etched on their hearts, a constant reminder of the price of freedom, the cost of trust, the enduring power of love and loyalty. The clock, damaged, began to chime, once again, to its normal time. Chapter 18. The Unveiling. The aftermath of the confrontation at Big Ben was a whirlwind of activity. Police interrogations, medical examinations, official debriefings. Margaret, Henry, Samuel, Elsie, and Jean-Luc were thrust into a world of bureaucracy and scrutiny, their actions, their motives, their loyalties questioned and examined. Ilse and Thorn, their conspiracy shattered, their network exposed, were taken into custody, facing charges of espionage, treason, and attempted murder. Their fate, though uncertain, was likely to be severe, a harsh punishment for their betrayal of trust, their violation of oaths, their contribution to the horrors of war. Margaret, Henry, and Samuel, initially treated with suspicion, were eventually exonerated, their actions vindicated, their courage recognized. They were hailed as heroes, unlikely saviors who had prevented a catastrophic attack, who had exposed a dangerous conspiracy, who had risked their lives for the greater good. But the accolades, the praise, the recognition, felt hollow, empty. The scars of betrayal, the wounds of loss, the trauma of war, remained, a constant reminder of the price they had paid, the sacrifices they had made. Henry, though physically recovering, was still haunted by the psychological trauma of his experiences. He struggled with nightmares, flashbacks, periods of disorientation and confusion. He was a changed man, his spirit wounded, his trust fractured, his innocence lost. Margaret, her own strength tested to its limits, remained by his side, her love unwavering, her support unconditional. She was his anchor, his lifeline, his connection to a world that had become increasingly complex, increasingly dangerous. Samuel, burdened by guilt and remorse for his initial betrayal, sought redemption through service. He volunteered to work with British intelligence, using his knowledge of Ilse's network, his understanding of her methods, to help dismantle the remaining vestiges of her conspiracy. Elsie, her nursing skills invaluable, continued to care for the wounded, her compassion and dedication a beacon of hope in the darkness of war. She remained a close friend to Margaret and Henry, a bond forged in the crucible of shared danger, shared loss, shared survival. Jean-Luc, his mission accomplished, his past avenged, his secrets revealed, returned to the shadows, to the clandestine world of the resistance, his work unfinished, his fight for freedom continuing. He remained a valuable ally, a trusted confidant, a silent guardian of their fragile peace. As the dust settled, as the investigations concluded, as the truth emerged, a final unveiling remained. The question of Thorn's motives, his reasons for betraying his country, his friends, his oaths, lingered, unanswered, a dark cloud hanging over their hard-won victory. Margaret, driven by a need for closure, for understanding, for a final reckoning, requested a meeting with Thorn, a face-to-face confrontation in the confines of his prison cell. She was granted permission, escorted by armed guards, led through the cold, sterile corridors of the prison, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing with questions, with accusations, with a lingering sense of disbelief. She entered Thorn's cell, a small, bare room, furnished only with a cot, a table, and a chair. He sat on the cot, his hands shackled, his face pale and drawn, his eyes filled with a mixture of defiance and regret. "Margaret," he said, his voice raspy and weak, "I didn't expect to see you again." "Why, Thorn?" she asked, her voice trembling with emotion. "Why did you do it? Why did you betray us?" He looked at her, his gaze unwavering, his expression unreadable.
"It's a long story," he said.
"I have time," Margaret replied, her voice firm and unwavering. He sighed, his shoulders slumping, his body seeming to deflate with the weight of his confession. He revealed a story of his own, a tale of disillusionment, of resentment, of a deep-seated anger towards a system he felt had betrayed him, had failed him, had used him and discarded him. He had been a promising young officer, ambitious, idealistic, dedicated to his country, to his duty, to his fellow soldiers. He had served with distinction, risen through the ranks, earned the respect of his peers, the admiration of his superiors. But then, he had been passed over for promotion, denied the recognition he felt he deserved, sidelined in favor of others less qualified, less experienced, less deserving. He had become bitter, resentful, his loyalty eroding, his faith in the system shattered. Ilsa had approached him, offering him an alternative, a chance to reclaim his pride, to avenge his perceived wrongs, to gain the power and recognition he craved. She had seduced him with promises of wealth, of influence, of a new world order, a world where he would be rewarded, not punished, for his talents. He had succumbed to her temptation, betraying his country, his friends, his oaths, becoming a pawn in her game, a tool of her ambition, a collaborator in her conspiracy. I was a fool, he said, his voice filled with self-loathing. A weak, pathetic fool. I let my anger, my resentment, my ambition, cloud my judgment, blind me to the truth. He looked at Margaret, his eyes filled with a genuine remorse, a belated recognition of the damage he had caused, the lives he had ruined.
I'm sorry, Margaret, he said.
I'm sorry for everything. Margaret listened to his confession, her heart aching with a mixture of anger, pity, and a strange sense of understanding. She saw the broken man beneath the facade of the traitor, the wounded spirit beneath the mask of defiance. She couldn't forgive him.
Not yet.
Perhaps not ever. But she could understand him. She could empathize with his pain, his disillusionment, his sense of betrayal. It's too late for apologies, Thorne, she said, her voice firm but devoid of malice. The damage is done. The lives are lost. The trust is broken. She stood to leave, her mission accomplished, her questions answered, her heart heavy with the weight of his confession. But, she added, turning back to face him, perhaps there is still hope. Hope for redemption. Hope for forgiveness. Hope for a future where such betrayals, such tragedies, will never happen again. She left the cell, leaving Thorne alone with his guilt, his remorse, his shattered dreams. She walked away, into the sunlight, into a world still scarred by war, still filled with danger, but also filled with a flicker of hope, a glimmer of light, a promise of a better tomorrow. She had one last thing to do. She had to talk to Henry. Chapter 19. Reckoning and Redemption. Margaret found Henry sitting by the Thames, his gaze fixed on the flowing water, his body still, his mind seemingly lost in contemplation. The cityscape around him, though scarred by war, held a quiet beauty, a resilience that mirrored the spirit of the people who inhabited it. She sat beside him, their shoulders touching, their silence a shared language of understanding, of shared trauma, of shared hope. He told me everything, Margaret said, her voice soft, her words carefully chosen.
Thorne.
He explained why. Henry nodded, his gaze remaining fixed on the river, his expression unreadable. It doesn't excuse it, he said, his voice raspy, his words slow and deliberate. But it explains it. He was broken, Margaret said. By the system. By the war. By his own ambition. Henry turned to face her, his eyes, though still shadowed by trauma, held a flicker of their former light, a spark of the man he once was.
We all are broken, he said.
In some way. The war breaks everyone. Margaret nodded, her heart aching with a shared sense of loss, of grief, of the enduring damage inflicted by conflict, by violence, by betrayal. But we can heal, she said, her voice firm, her belief unwavering. We can rebuild. We can find our way back. She took his hand, her fingers interlacing with his, their touch a silent connection, a reaffirmation of their love, their loyalty, their shared journey through darkness and into light. I love you, Margaret, Henry said, his voice choked with emotion. You saved me. You brought me back. Margaret smiled, a genuine smile, a smile that reached her eyes, a smile that reflected the resilience of her spirit, the enduring power of her love. We saved each other, Henry, she said. We always will. They sat in silence for a while, their hands clasped together, their bodies close, their hearts beating in unison. The river flowed, carrying away the debris of the past, the wreckage of war, the remnants of betrayal.
What now?
Henry asked, his voice hesitant, his future uncertain. Margaret looked at him, her eyes filled with a newfound determination, a renewed sense of purpose. "We rebuild," she said. "We heal. We create a new life. A life free from fear, free from shadows, free from war." She paused, her gaze shifting towards the city, towards the future, towards the promise of a better tomorrow.
"We have a duty," she said.
"To remember, to honor the fallen, to prevent this from happening again." She turned back to Henry, her eyes shining with a fierce determination, a passionate commitment to justice, to peace, to a world free from the horrors they had witnessed, the betrayals they had endured. "We'll work together," she said, "to expose the truth, to fight for justice, to build a better world." Henry nodded, his eyes mirroring her determination, his spirit rekindled by her unwavering belief in their shared purpose. "Together," he said, his voice firm, his resolve strengthened. "Always." They stood, their hands still clasped together, their bodies facing the future, their hearts filled with a mixture of hope, of grief, of determination. They had survived the war, the betrayal, the darkness. They had found their way back to each other, their love strengthened, their bond unbreakable. They would face the future together, hand in hand, heart to heart, their scars a reminder of the past, their love a beacon for the future. They would rebuild, they would heal, they would remember, they would honor, they would fight for a better world. They would, together, turn the tide of war toward peace. Margaret took a deep breath, feeling the crisp air. But first, she spoke, her voice like a gentle breeze. "We go home." Chapter 20. A future forged in fire. Home. The word, spoken with a mixture of longing and trepidation, hung in the air, a promise of solace, a return to a life that had been shattered, a future that remained uncertain. The journey back to New York was a stark contrast to their perilous voyage to England. They traveled on a passenger liner, a vessel filled with returning soldiers, war brides, and civilians seeking to rebuild their lives, to escape the ravages of war, to find a semblance of normalcy in a world forever changed. The crossing was smooth, uneventful, a welcome respite from the chaos and danger they had endured. But the calm seas, the clear skies, the comfortable accommodations could not entirely erase the shadows of the past, the memories of betrayal, the scars of war. Henry, though physically healed, still struggled with the psychological trauma of his experiences. He was quieter, more withdrawn, his nights punctuated by nightmares, his days haunted by flashbacks. But he was also stronger, more resilient, his spirit tempered by fire, his love for Margaret a constant source of strength and comfort. Margaret, her own strength tested to its limits, remained his anchor, his guide, his unwavering support. She understood his pain, his struggles, his silent battles. She had shared his journey, witnessed his trauma, endured her own losses. They spent their days on deck, watching the ocean, talking, sharing their memories, their fears, their hopes for the future. They spoke of their dreams, of a life beyond the war, of a home filled with love, with laughter, with peace. They spoke of their duty, of their commitment to exposing the truth, to fighting for justice, to preventing future conflicts, to honoring the fallen. They planned to write, to speak, to advocate for peace, to share their story, to ensure that the horrors they had witnessed, the betrayals they had endured, would never be forgotten. They arrived in New York Harbor, the Statue of Liberty a welcoming beacon, a symbol of hope, of freedom, of a new beginning. The city, though touched by the war, seemed vibrant, resilient, a testament to the enduring spirit of its people. They returned to the boarding house, to Mrs. O'Malley's warm embrace, to the familiar surroundings that had once been their sanctuary, their haven, their home. The room, though small and cluttered, felt different now, filled with a new sense of purpose, a renewed commitment to their shared future. They began to rebuild their lives, slowly, painstakingly, brick by brick. Henry, with Margaret's support, sought help for his psychological trauma, attending therapy sessions, learning to cope with his nightmares, his flashbacks, his inner demons. Margaret, Drawing upon her nursing skills, her wartime experiences, her unwavering compassion, volunteered at a local hospital, caring for wounded soldiers, supporting their families, offering comfort and hope to those who had suffered the ravages of war. They worked together, tirelessly, to expose the truth about Thorn and Ilse's conspiracy, sharing their story with journalists, with government officials, with anyone who would listen. They faced skepticism, resistance, disbelief, but they persevered, driven by a fierce determination to see justice served, to prevent future betrayals, to honor the memory of those who had been lost. Their efforts eventually bore fruit. Their story, initially dismissed as the ravings of a shell-shocked soldier and a grieving fiancé, gained traction, attracting the attention of investigative journalists, of government investigators, of the public. Thorn and Ilse's network was further exposed, their collaborators identified, their crimes brought to light. The truth, long suppressed, long hidden, finally emerged, vindicating Margaret and Henry, revealing the extent of the conspiracy, highlighting the dangers of unchecked ambition, the corrosive power of betrayal. They became symbols of courage, of resilience, of the enduring power of love and loyalty in the face of adversity. They were invited to speak at rallies, to address veterans groups, to share their experiences, to advocate for peace, to inspire others to fight for a better world. Their lives, once shattered by war, by betrayal, by loss, were gradually rebuilt, transformed, forged in the fire of their experiences. They had found their purpose, their calling, their mission. They had found their way back to each other, their love stronger, deeper, more profound than ever before. As the war finally ended, as the world began to heal, as peace, fragile but real, settled upon the land, Margaret and Henry stood together, hand in hand, heart to heart, ready to face the future, ready to build a new life, ready to honor the past, ready to create a better tomorrow. They had learned that peace was fragile, that trust must always be double-checked, and that love could, truly, conquer all. They looked at each other and smiled. The war had changed them, yes, but it would not define them. Together they would find and build their perfect world. Epilogue. Years passed. The roar of cannons faded, replaced by the laughter of children, the hum of industry, the quiet murmur of a world slowly healing. New York, once a city bracing for war, blossomed again, its skyline reaching ever higher, its streets teeming with life, its spirit undimmed. Margaret and Henry, their names etched in the annals of wartime heroism, lived a life that was both extraordinary and remarkably ordinary. They built their home, not in a grand mansion, but in a modest house filled with warmth, with books, with the echoes of shared stories and whispered dreams. Henry, though forever marked by the war, found a measure of peace. The nightmares lessened, the flashbacks faded, replaced by a quiet strength, a deep empathy for those who had suffered, a fierce commitment to building a better future. He worked, not as a soldier, but as a teacher, sharing his knowledge, his wisdom, his experiences with a new generation, instilling in them a love of learning, a respect for peace, a commitment to justice. Margaret, her nursing skills honed by the crucible of war, continued to care for others. She worked, not in a bustling hospital, but in a small community clinic, tending to the sick, comforting the afflicted, offering hope and healing to those in need. She became a pillar of her community, a source of strength and compassion, a living testament to the enduring power of the human spirit. They had children, a son and a daughter, who grew up in a world vastly different from the one their parents had endured. They learned about the war, about the sacrifices made, about the importance of peace, not from textbooks, but from the stories told by their parents, from the scars they bore, from the love that bound them together. Samuel, his redemption complete, remained a close friend, a frequent visitor to their home, a silent witness to their enduring love, their unwavering commitment to each other. He found his own peace, his own purpose, working as an investigator, uncovering corruption, fighting injustice, seeking to make amends for his past mistakes. Elsie, her wartime experiences shaping her life, became a renowned advocate for veterans' rights, her voice a powerful force for change, her compassion a beacon of hope for those who had served. She remained a cherished friend, a sister in arms, a constant reminder of the bonds forged in the fires of conflict. Jean-Luc, his clandestine life a distant memory, returned to France, to his homeland, to a life of quiet service, his wartime exploits known only to a select few. He occasionally corresponded with Margaret and Henry, their letters a testament to their shared experiences, their enduring respect, their unspoken bond. The telegram, the faded piece of paper that had set their extraordinary journey in motion, remained a treasured keepsake, a reminder of the past, a symbol of their love, a testament to their courage. It was kept in a small, wooden box, alongside Henry's unsent letter, a tangible link to a time of darkness, of danger, of unwavering hope. As the years turned into decades, as the world changed, as new challenges arose, Margaret and Henry remained steadfast, their love a constant, their commitment unwavering, their lives a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit. They grew old together, their hair silvered, their bodies frail, their steps slower, but their love remained as vibrant, as passionate, as unwavering as the day they had first met. They had faced death, betrayal, and despair, but they had emerged stronger, wiser, more deeply connected than ever before. One evening, as the sun set, casting a golden glow over the city, Margaret and Henry sat on their porch, hand in hand, watching the world go by. They had lived a full life, a life filled with love, with loss, with adventure, with purpose. "We did it," Henry whispered, his voice raspy with age, his eyes filled with a deep, abiding love. Margaret smiled, her heart overflowing with gratitude, with peace, with a profound sense of contentment. "Yes, Henry," she said, her voice soft but firm. "We did it. Together." They closed their eyes, their hands still clasped together, their hearts beating as one. They had faced the darkness, and they had found the light. They had endured the storm, and they had reached the shore. They had lived, they had loved, they had made a difference. And as the stars emerged, as the night enveloped them, as the world continued its ceaseless journey, Margaret and Henry, their love eternal, their story complete, found their final, well done.